Have you ever felt like you didn't belong anywhere? Like you were caught between two worlds, never quite fitting into either one? That's exactly how Sage Chin felt every single day of her 26 years, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of Morrison and Associates accounting firm at nearly midnight on a Thursday. Those blue eyes stared back at her, the same eyes that had earned her whispers and stares her entire life. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're watching from, and if you've ever felt like an outsider looking in. Your stories always inspire me, and I read every single comment. Her reflection showed the exhaustion she felt deep in her bones. Dark circles shadowed those infamous blue eyes, and her black hair hung limply around her shoulders after another 14-hour day. At this rate, she'd never make partner at the firm, no matter how many late nights she pulled or how perfectly she balanced every client's books. The senior partners saw her as the diversity hire, nothing more. She was Korean enough to check their minority box, but not Korean enough to fit in with her own family, and definitely not American enough to truly belong in the corporate world she'd fought so hard to enter. Sage splashed cold water on her face and gathered her things. The office building was eerily quiet, most floors dark except for the security lights and the occasional cleaning crew. She'd gotten used to being the last one here, staying late partly because she had nowhere else to go and partly because she hoped someone would notice her dedication. So far, the only person who'd noticed was Harold from security, who always gave her a concerned look when he did his final rounds. The elevator descended slowly toward the parking garage, each floor marked by a soft ding that echoed in the empty shaft. Sage checked her phone absently, scrolling through missed calls from her mother. 3 voicemails, probably all variations of the same theme. When was she going to find a nice Korean boy and settle down? When was she going to stop trying so hard to be something she wasn't? When was she going to accept that those blue eyes made her different, and different wasn't something their family celebrated? Those eyes were the result of her great-grandmother's brief marriage to an Irish immigrant, a detail that had been whispered about in her family for generations. Most of the genetic markers had been bred out over the years, but somehow those recessive blue genes had found their way to Sage, making her a living reminder of a love story her traditional family preferred to forget. She'd spent her childhood wishing she looked more like her cousins, with their beautiful dark eyes and the kind of Korean features that fit seamlessly into their community. The parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty at this hour. Sage's footsteps echoed against the concrete as she walked toward her modest Honda Civic, parked in the far corner where the monthly rates were cheapest. She was fumbling for her keys when she heard voices carrying across the garage, low and urgent in a way that made her freeze. 3 men in expensive suits stood near a black Mercedes, their body language tense with barely contained aggression. Even from this distance, Sage could see that this wasn't a friendly business meeting. One man gestured sharply with his hands while speaking in rapid Korean, his voice rising with each word. Another man, younger and broader, kept his hand inside his jacket in a way that made Sage's blood run cold. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to get in her car and drive away without looking back. But she couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away from the confrontation unfolding 50 feet away. The third man, tall and lean with perfectly styled dark hair, stood with the kind of stillness that suggested coiled danger. His voice was too low for her to make out the words, but his tone was sharp enough to cut glass. That's when she saw the guns. The broader man had pulled his weapon, pointing it directly at the tall man's chest. Sage's purse slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the concrete with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire garage like a gunshot. All 3 men turned toward her instantly, and she found herself pinned under their collective gaze like a butterfly on display. The tall man moved first, faster than should have been possible. In one fluid motion, he dove towards Sage while shouting something in Korean. The gunshot that followed was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, concrete chips exploding from the pillar behind where the tall man had been standing just moments before. Sage felt strong arms wrap around her waist, pulling her down behind a concrete support beam as more shots rang out. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain it would burst. The man holding her was solid and warm, his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of gunpowder and fear. She could feel the controlled power in his frame, the way he positioned himself between her and the shooters without hesitation. More shots, then running footsteps. Car doors slamming, tires squealing against concrete as a vehicle sped away. The silence that followed was almost worse than the gunfire, broken only by Sage's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the garage's ventilation system. "Are you hurt?" The voice was deep and concerned, with just a trace of an accent that suggested English wasn't his first language. "Miss, can you hear me? Are you injured?" Sage realized she was shaking uncontrollably. When she tried to speak, only a whisper emerged. I think I'm okay." The man shifted slightly, giving her space while keeping one protective hand on her shoulder. When she finally looked up, she found herself staring into the most intense dark eyes she'd ever seen. His face was sharp-featured and undeniably handsome, with the kind of bone structure that belonged in magazines. A small cut on his cheekbone leaked blood where concrete debris had grazed him. "We need to get you out of here," he said, scanning the garage with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to danger. "They might come back with reinforcements." Who were those people? Sage's voice was stronger now, though her hands still trembled as she reached for her scattered purse contents. What did they want? "Business associates with a difference of opinion," he said grimly, helping her gather her things with quick, efficient movements. His hands were strong and surprisingly gentle, she noticed, with a thin scar across the knuckles that spoke of old violence. "The important thing is getting you somewhere safe." Safe? The word felt foreign on her tongue. She'd never been in real danger before, never had someone shoot actual bullets in her direction. "I should call the police." "No." His response was immediate and firm. "No police. Not yet. These men have long reach and expensive lawyers. Reporting this will only put you in more danger." Sage stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "More danger? I don't understand. I just work here. I'm nobody important." Something shifted in his expression, a fleeting softness that transformed his austere features. "You witnessed something you shouldn't have seen. In my world, that makes you extremely important." He stood and extended his hand to help her up. "My name is Gene Nakamura, and you're coming with me. I can't just go with you. I don't even know you." But even as she protested, Sage found herself taking his hand and allowing him to pull her to her feet. His touch sent an unexpected warmth up her arm, a feeling that had nothing to do with the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Jean studied her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. She was acutely aware of how she must look after 14 hours at the office, her makeup smudged and her hair disheveled. But his gaze wasn't judgmental. If anything, there was something like wonder in his dark eyes as he took in her features. "Your eyes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They're remarkable." Heat flooded Sage's cheeks. She'd heard variations of that comment her entire life, usually delivered with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Korean grandmothers who clicked their tongues and whispered about mixed bloodlines. Classmates who asked invasive questions about her ancestry. Coworkers who assumed she was adopted or wearing colored contacts. "They're just blue," she said defensively, the automatic response she'd perfected over decades of unwanted attention. "Just blue." Jin's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time since the shooting, something that might have been amusement crossed his features. "In my family, blue eyes are considered extraordinarily lucky. My grandmother would say you were blessed by the spirits." Before Sage could respond to that unexpected comment, the sound of car engines echoed from the garage entrance. Jin's entire demeanor shifted instantly, all traces of warmth disappearing as he went on high alert. "We're leaving. Now." His hand found the small of her back, guiding her toward the exit with urgent but controlled pressure. "My car is on the next level up." "Wait, what about my car?" Sage looked back toward her Honda, abandoned near the scene of what she was beginning to realize was a very serious crime. "Leave it. I'll have someone collect it later." Jin's tone brooked no argument. Right now, staying alive is more important than transportation. They moved quickly through the stairwell, Jean keeping pace with her shorter stride while constantly checking behind them. Sage's mind reeled as she tried to process everything that had happened in the span of 10 minutes. This morning, her biggest concern had been whether she'd remembered to submit the Henderson account reconciliation. Now she was fleeing a parking garage with a man who spoke casually about having people collect abandoned vehicles and families who believed in lucky eyes. "What kind of business are you in?" she asked as they emerged onto the third level, where a sleek black Audi waited near the elevator bank. Jin's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. Import and export, among other things. He opened the passenger door for her with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed at odds with the dangers surrounding them. The car's interior was immaculate and expensive, all leather and technology that probably cost more than Sage made in 6 months. She sank into the passenger seat and tried to convince herself this was really happening. Other things, she pressed as Jin slid behind the wheel and started the engine with a quiet purr of German engineering. "Ask me again when we're somewhere secure," he said, pulling out of the parking space with the smooth confidence of someone very comfortable behind the wheel of a performance vehicle. "For now, just know that those men wanted to send a message to my family. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Your family." Sage studied his profile as they wound their way up and out of the garage. Strong jaw, aquiline nose, the kind of bone structure that suggested good genetics and possibly noble ancestry. What kind of family requires armed business meetings in parking garages? Jin glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. They were moving through downtown traffic now, though at this hour the streets were mostly empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery truck. The kind that's been importing and exporting for over 100 years. The kind that values loyalty above everything else. The kind that protects what belongs to them. Something in his tone made Sage's pulse quicken, though she couldn't quite identify whether the feeling was fear or excitement. "And what exactly belongs to your family?" "Territory, businesses, people we care about." He took a right turn onto a street Sage didn't recognize, heading toward what looked like the upscale residential district on the city's east side. "As of tonight, that includes you." "Me?" The word came out as a squeak. "Why me?" Jin was quiet for several minutes, navigating through increasingly affluent neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the streetlights more decorative. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Because you saw their faces. Because they know you saw their faces. And because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because something about you calls to me in a way I didn't expect." Sage's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. The men she dated had been polite and practical, relationships built on shared interests and mutual convenience. None of them had ever suggested she called to them, especially not in a voice that held that particular note of wondering surprise. "I still don't understand what's happening," she admitted as they pulled into the circular driveway of what could only be described as a mansion. The house was modern and sprawling, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed with warm light. "This morning I was worried about quarterly reports. Now I'm apparently under the protection of someone who—" She gestured helplessly at the house. "Someone who lives like this." "Someone who what?" Jin turned off the engine and shifted to face her fully. In the dim lighting from the dashboard, his eyes looked almost black, intense and searching. "Someone who's obviously very different from me." Sage tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture she'd never been able to break. "I don't belong in places like this. I don't belong in situations like this." "You don't belong." Jin repeated her words slowly, as if testing their weight. "Because of your eyes? Because of your mixed heritage? Because some people made you feel like you didn't fit their narrow definitions?" Heat stung behind Sage's eyes. How could he see through her so easily when they'd just met? "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think." Jin's voice was gentle but firm. "I understand what it's like to carry the weight of other people's expectations. To feel like you're living between worlds that never quite accept you completely." He reached across the center console and touched her hand briefly, the contact sending warmth shooting up her arm. "But I also understand that sometimes the things that make us different are the very things that make us powerful." Before Sage could respond, the front door of the house opened and a figure appeared silhouetted against the warm light from inside. Even from this distance, she could see it was an older woman, small and elegant, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to late-night arrivals. "That's my grandmother," Jean said, following her gaze. "She's been waiting up for us." "Waiting for us? How could she possibly know? I called her from the car while you were processing what happened." Jin's smile was softer now, more genuine. "She'll want to meet you properly. To see your eyes for herself." "Jean." Sage grabbed his arm as he started to get out of the car. The touch was electric, sending awareness skittering across her nerve endings in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the very attractive man whose strength had saved her life. I'm scared. He went very still under her touch, his dark eyes searching her face. Scared of my grandmother? She's barely 5 feet tall and makes the best kimchi in 3 counties. Scared of all of this. Sage's gesture encompassed the car, the house, the situation, and most especially the way her heart raced when he looked at her like that. I've never been involved in anything dangerous. I've never had anyone shoot at me. I've never felt. She trailed off, unable to name the electric awareness that had been building between them since the moment he'd pulled her to safety. Never felt what? His voice was low and rough around the edges. Never felt like someone saw me. Really saw me. The admission came out as barely more than a whisper. Not the eyes that make me different. Not the mixed blood that makes me not quite Korean enough. Just me. Jean was quiet for a long moment, his thumb stroking absently across her knuckles where her hand still gripped his arm. In my family, he said finally, we believe that the spirits guide important people into our lives when we need them most. My grandmother will take one look at those blue eyes and declare you were sent to bring our family good fortune. And what will you declare? The question slipped out before Sage could stop it, bold and breathless, and unlike anything she'd ever asked a man before. Jin's smile was slow and devastating, transforming his austere features into something that made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. I'll declare that for the first time in my adult life, I believe my grandmother might be right. The older woman on the porch called out something in Korean, her voice carrying clearly across the night air. Jean responded in the same language, the fluid syllables rolling off his tongue with native ease. Whatever he said made the woman laugh, a sound of pure delight that made Sage feel slightly less terrified about whatever she was walking into. What did you tell her? Sage asked as they finally got out of the car. I told her I brought home someone very special. Jean walked around to her side and offered his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. Someone with eyes like the summer sky and courage like the mountain spirits. That's very poetic for someone in import and export, Sage observed, though she found herself taking his arm and letting him guide her toward the house. My grandmother raised me on poetry and old stories, Jean said. She believes words have power, that the right words spoken at the right time can change someone's entire destiny. As they approached the front door, Sage caught her first clear look at Jin's grandmother. She was indeed small and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a beautiful hanbok in deep blue silk, the traditional dress somehow making the late hour feel formal and significant. But it was the expression on her face that made Sage's breath catch. The older woman was staring at her with something approaching reverence, her hands pressed together in front of her heart as if she'd just witnessed a miracle. Halmiani, Jean said respectfully as they reached the door. This is Sage Chun. His grandmother stepped forward and took Sage's hands in both of hers, studying her face with the same intensity Jean had shown in the parking garage. When their eyes met, the older woman gasped and said something in rapid Korean that made Jin's eyebrows rise in surprise. What did she say? Sage asked, feeling heat creep up her neck under the grandmother's scrutiny. Jean translated slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe the words himself. She says you have the eyes of the sea spirits, and that you've come to bring peace to a family that has known too much war. He paused, his own gaze finding hers. She says you're the answer to prayers she's been saying for 30 years. Before Sage could process that statement, Jin's grandmother pulled her into a warm embrace that smelled of jasmine tea and something that might have been incense. The woman spoke again, this time directly to Sage in careful, accented English. Welcome home, precious girl, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Welcome home at last. Standing there in the doorway of a house she'd never seen before, held by a woman she'd just met, protected by a man whose world was dangerous and foreign and utterly unlike anything she'd ever imagined, Sage felt something she hadn't experienced in 26 years of feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Jin's hand found the small of her back again, warm and reassuring and possessive in a way that should have alarmed her, but instead made her feel precious and protected. His grandmother stepped back to study them both, her lined face creased with satisfaction, as if she'd just witnessed the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. Come. the older woman said, gesturing them inside. There is much to discuss, and the night is still dangerous for those who walk between worlds. As they crossed the threshold into the warm light of the house, Sage caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her blue eyes looked bright and alert despite her exhaustion, and for the first time in her life, she didn't automatically wish they were different. In this house, with these people, those eyes that had always marked her as an outsider might finally mark her as someone who belonged. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as Jin's hand guided her deeper into his family's world, Sage felt the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. Jin's grandmother insisted on serving tea despite the late hour, bustling around the elegant kitchen with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she was more energized than tired by their midnight arrival. Sage found herself seated at a marble kitchen island that probably cost more than her annual salary, watching the older woman prepare what looked like a formal tea service with practiced efficiency. The house was even more impressive from the inside than it had appeared from the driveway. Everything spoke of old money and careful taste, from the original artwork on the walls to the antique Korean furniture that had clearly been passed down through generations. Yet somehow it felt warm rather than intimidating, lived in rather than museum-like. Jin had excused himself to make phone calls, speaking in rapid Korean from what appeared to be a study just off the main hallway. Even through the closed door, Sage could hear the urgency in his voice, the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that weren't questioned. The sound sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way command looked on him. She shouldn't be thinking about how attractive he was. She should be thinking about calling the police, about getting herself somewhere actually safe, about the fact that she was sitting in the kitchen of a man she'd met less than 2 hours ago after watching him engage in what was clearly some kind of organized crime dispute. Normal people didn't have armed confrontations in parking garages. Normal people didn't live in houses like this or have grandmothers who spoke about sea spirits with complete sincerity. But nothing about tonight felt normal, and if she was being honest with herself, nothing about her attraction to Jin felt normal either. She'd never been the type to fall for dangerous men or find herself drawn to complicated situations. Her dating history was a parade of accountants and engineers, men who were safe and predictable and utterly forgettable. Men who never looked at her like Jin had looked at her, as if she was something rare and precious that he wanted to protect and possess in equal measure. The grandmother, whose name Sage still didn't know, set a delicate porcelain cup in front of her filled with tea that smelled like flowers and something faintly medicinal. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, each word chosen with deliberate precision. My name is Uni, but you may call me Halmini if you like. It means grandmother, but in our family it is a term of love and respect for any woman who has earned her place at the heart of things. Sage wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to do with her nervous energy. The tea was soothing and complex, with layers of flavor that revealed themselves gradually. Thank you, Halmini. This is beautiful. Everything here is beautiful. Uni smiled and patted Sage's hand with surprising strength for someone so small. Beautiful things are drawn to beautiful things, she said with the kind of matter-of-fact certainty that suggested this was simply how the world worked. My grandson has good taste, but tonight he has outdone himself. Heat flooded Sage's cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments about her appearance, especially not from elegant Korean grandmothers who spoke about destiny and sea spirits. I'm not really beautiful, she said automatically, the self-deprecating response that had become second nature over the years. I'm just different. Yunhee's expression shifted, becoming fierce in a way that transformed her gentle features into something formidable. Different is not the opposite of beautiful, child. Different is what makes beauty memorable. Those eyes of yours, they are a gift from the spirits. Anyone who made you believe otherwise was a fool. Before Sage could respond to that unexpected defense, Jin reappeared in the doorway. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms that were muscled and marked with what looked like the edge of an intricate tattoo. The sight made her mouth go dry with an awareness she definitely shouldn't be feeling given the circumstances. Everything's arranged, he said, though his expression remained tense. Marcus will keep watch tonight, and we'll move you to a more secure location tomorrow. Move me where? Sage set down her teacup with hands that weren't quite steady. I have a job. I have responsibilities. I can't just disappear because of what happened tonight. Jean exchanged a look with his grandmother that was loaded with meaning Sage couldn't interpret. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but implacable. Those responsibilities won't matter if you're dead. And after tonight, staying in your normal routine would be a death sentence. A death sentence. The words hit her like a physical blow, making the elegant kitchen suddenly feel surreal and dreamlike. This morning she'd been worried about spreadsheets and client deadlines. Now a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine was telling her that her life was in danger from people with guns and expensive suits. I don't understand why they'd want to hurt me, she said, hating how small her voice sounded. I just work for an accounting firm. I process tax returns and reconcile bank statements. I'm nobody important. You witnessed a territorial dispute between rival factions, Jean said, settling onto the stool beside her with fluid grace. His proximity made her hyper-aware of the heat radiating from his body, the way his expensive cologne mixed with something that was purely masculine. The Tanaka family has been trying to move into our territory for months. Tonight was their attempt to intimidate us into backing down. Our territory, Sage repeated, trying to process what he was telling her. You keep saying our family and our territory. What exactly is your family's business? Jean was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as if he was trying to gauge how much truth she could handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. My family has been involved in import and export for 4 generations. We facilitate trade relationships, provide security services, and maintain business partnerships throughout the Pacific Rim. That sounded like a very diplomatic way of saying something he didn't want to say directly. Sage might spend her days with numbers rather than people, but she wasn't naive. Import and export businesses didn't typically involve armed confrontations or require moving witnesses to secure locations. Security services, she said slowly. What kind of security services? The kind that keeps honest business owners from being extorted by criminals, Jean said. The kind that ensures shipments reach their destinations without interference. The kind that protects families like yours when they get caught in situations beyond their control. His answer was smooth and practiced, but Sage caught the subtle evasion. She also caught the way his grandmother's lips tightened slightly, as if she disapproved of her grandson's diplomatic phrasing. You're involved in organized crime, Sage said. It wasn't a question. Jin's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tensing that suggested she'd crossed into territory he preferred to keep undefined. I'm involved in maintaining order in a world where the official authorities are often ineffective or corrupt, he said finally. Sometimes that requires methods that exist outside conventional law enforcement. Which is a very elegant way of saying yes, Sage thought, though she kept the observation to herself. The smart thing would be to insist on police protection, to distance herself from whatever world Jean inhabited, to go back to her safe, predictable life of tax forms and quarterly reports. Instead, she found herself asking, why didn't you just leave me there tonight? You could have walked away and let those men handle their business without getting a civilian involved. Jin's smile was slow and devastating, crinkling the corners of his eyes in a way that made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. Because leaving you there wasn't an option, he said simply. Because the moment I saw those blue eyes, I knew you were meant to be protected. Meant to be protected. The words sent warmth spiraling through her chest, a feeling of being valued and treasured that was entirely foreign to her experience. No one had ever suggested she was meant for anything except blending into the background and trying not to draw attention to her differences. Your eyes really are remarkable, Jean continued, his voice dropping to something lower and more intimate. In Korean folklore, blue eyes are said to belong to spirits who can see through to the truth of things. People blessed with such sight are considered powerful allies and dangerous enemies. Sage had heard variations of that kind of mystical interpretation before, usually from well-meaning relatives trying to put a positive spin on her unusual genetics. But when Jean said it, looking at her with that particular intensity, it didn't sound like platitude or consolation. It sounded like he genuinely believed she possessed something valuable. I've never thought of myself as particularly insightful, she admitted. Usually people just ask if I'm wearing contacts or if I'm half something other than Korean. Half something other than Korean, Uni repeated with obvious distaste, as if being mixed made you less than whole rather than more than the sum of your parts. She turned to Jean and said something in rapid Korean that made him nod seriously. What did she say? Sage asked. She said that people who fear difference are usually people who lack the courage to be different themselves, Jean translated, and that anyone who made you feel ashamed of those eyes was too small-minded to deserve your attention. The fierce defense from a woman she'd met less than an hour ago made Sage's throat tight with unexpected emotion. She'd grown up surrounded by subtle and not-so-subtle messages that her appearance was somehow problematic, something to be explained or apologized for. Having someone declare her critics unworthy of her attention was a novel and deeply moving experience. She's very kind, Sage managed. She's also very protective of people she considers family, Jean said, his gaze holding hers with steady warmth. And she's already decided you belong to us. Belong to us. The phrase should have alarmed her, should have triggered every independent instinct she'd cultivated during her years of making her own way in the world. Instead, it made her feel something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the deep security of being claimed by people who would fight for her. I should be more scared than I am, she said honestly. I should be demanding police protection and insisting on going home to my own apartment and my own life. Instead, I'm sitting here drinking tea with the grandmother of a man who's clearly involved in something illegal, and I feel safer than I have in years. Jin's expression shifted, becoming more serious. You should be scared. What I do, what my family does, it's dangerous. People who get close to us sometimes get hurt. I would never forgive myself if something happened to you because of me. But you're not going to let anything happen to me, Sage said with sudden certainty. She wasn't sure where the confidence came from, but looking at Jin's face, seeing the fierce protectiveness in his dark eyes, she felt absolutely secure in that knowledge. No, he said quietly. I'm not. The intensity of his promise hung between them, loaded with implications that made Sage's pulse quicken. She was acutely aware of how close he was sitting, of the way his rolled-up sleeves revealed the corded strength of his forearms, of the slight roughness in his voice when he spoke about protecting her. Jean, she started, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing that the moment felt significant in ways she couldn't articulate. He leaned slightly closer, his hand moving as if he intended to touch her face. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility, with the electric awareness that had been building since the moment he'd pulled her to safety in the parking garage. The sharp chime of Jin's phone shattered the moment like glass breaking. He straightened immediately, the tender expression disappearing as he checked the message with practiced efficiency. Marcus says there's been movement around your apartment building, he told her, his voice returning to the crisp authority she'd heard during his phone calls. 3 cars with Tanaka family plates circling the block. They're definitely looking for you. The words hit Sage like ice water, making her realize how completely she'd gotten lost in the warmth of Jin's attention and his grandmother's acceptance. Real people with real guns were apparently searching for her right now, and she was sitting here fantasizing about a man whose protection might be the only thing standing between her and serious harm. So what happens now? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady. Now you stay here where it's safe, Jean said, already reaching for his suit jacket. I'll have someone collect your things from your apartment and bring them here. Tomorrow we'll discuss longer-term arrangements. Longer-term arrangements. The phrase suggested that this situation wouldn't be resolved quickly, that her life as she knew it was about to change in fundamental ways. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, looking at Jin's determined expression and feeling the warm support of his grandmother's presence, Sage found herself thinking that maybe some changes were worth the risk. All right, she said simply. I trust you. Jin's hand stilled on his jacket, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Those 3 words seemed to affect him more profoundly than anything else she'd said all evening. You shouldn't, he said quietly, but I'm grateful that you do. As he headed for the door to coordinate whatever security measures were necessary, Sage caught her reflection in the polished surface of the refrigerator. Her blue eyes looked bright and alert despite her exhaustion, and for the first time in her adult life, she didn't automatically wish they were different. In this house, with these people, those eyes that had always marked her as different might finally be exactly what she was meant to be. The night was far from over, and morning would bring new challenges and complications she couldn't yet imagine. But sitting in Jin's kitchen, protected by his strength and embraced by his grandmother's fierce acceptance, Sage felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Sage woke to the scent of something delicious cooking and sunlight streaming through curtains that definitely weren't hers. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, trying to orient herself in the elegant guest room Jean had shown her to sometime after midnight. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the morning light, like something that had happened to someone else entirely. The bed was more comfortable than anything she'd ever slept in, with Egyptian cotton sheets and a mattress that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see a garden that looked professionally maintained, all carefully pruned trees and artfully arranged stone features that spoke of both money and taste. Her clothes from yesterday were neatly folded on a chair beside the bed, but someone had also provided a selection of options that looked suspiciously like they were exactly her size. A silk blouse in deep emerald, tailored black slacks, even undergarments that appeared to be the correct measurements. The efficiency of it was both thoughtful and slightly unnerving. When she finally made her way downstairs, following the scent of cooking and the sound of quiet conversation, she found Jean and his grandmother in the kitchen. They were speaking in Korean, their voices low and serious in a way that made her hesitate in the doorway. Jean was dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down with the sleeves rolled up, looking more relaxed than he had the night before, but no less devastatingly handsome. "Good morning," Uni said warmly as soon as she noticed Sage hovering uncertainly. "You look rested. Green is an excellent color on you." "Thank you," Sage said, crossing to accept the cup of coffee Jean was already preparing for her. "And thank you for the clothes. They fit perfectly." Jin's expression was carefully neutral as he handed her the mug. "I had someone stop by a boutique this morning. I estimated your size based on observation." He'd been observing her closely enough to determine her exact clothing measurements. The thought sent warmth spiraling through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. She wasn't used to men paying that kind of detailed attention to her, especially not men who looked like Jean and clearly had their choice of women. "Marcus called this morning," Jean continued, settling beside her at the kitchen island with his own coffee. "Your apartment building is still being watched, but they've moved to a more discreet surveillance pattern. We think they're waiting to see if you'll return. So they definitely know where I live," Sage said. "It wasn't really a question. They know everything about you by now," Jean said grimly. "Your employment history, your educational background, your family members. The Tanaka family is thorough when they consider someone a threat." The casual way he discussed her life being investigated made Sage's stomach clench with anxiety. These people had spent hours researching her, learning details about her existence that she'd never volunteered. The violation of privacy was almost worse than the physical danger. "What about my job?" she asked, trying to focus on practical concerns rather than the rising panic. "I was supposed to be in early today for the Morrison quarterly review. I called your office this morning," Uni said gently. "Explained that you had a family emergency and would be taking some personal time. They were very understanding." "You call my office?" Sage stared at the older woman, not sure whether to be grateful or alarmed. "What did you tell them exactly?" Yuni's smile was serenely innocent. "That your beloved great-aunt and soul had taken ill, and you needed to be with family during this difficult time. I may have implied that the situation was quite serious." Jin's lips twitched with what might have been amusement. "My grandmother is very convincing when she needs to be. She managed to get you 2 weeks of emergency family leave without requiring any documentation." 2 weeks. The timeline made this situation feel more real and more frightening. They were planning for her to be hidden away for 2 weeks minimum, which suggested that resolving the threat wasn't going to be quick or simple. "What happens if it takes longer than 2 weeks?" Sage asked. "Then we'll handle it," Jean said with the kind of quiet certainty that suggested he was accustomed to handling complicated problems. "My family has resources. We'll make sure your life is protected, including your employment." The matter-of-fact way he discussed rearranging her existence should have been infuriating. Instead, Sage found herself feeling touched by his obvious determination to shield her from the consequences of something that wasn't her fault. No one had ever taken care of practical details for her before. She'd been handling her own problems since college, navigating bureaucracy and workplace politics and financial challenges entirely alone. You don't have to do all this, she said quietly. I could figure out another way to handle the situation. Jean set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. There is no other way, Sage. These aren't people who can be reasoned with or bought off. They've decided you're a threat to their operations, which means they'll keep coming until the threat is eliminated. Eliminated. The word made her mouth go dry. Until I'm eliminated, you mean? Jin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's not going to happen. The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. She was beginning to understand that Jean wasn't just offering her temporary shelter out of some sense of obligation. The way he looked at her, spoke about her safety, positioned himself between her and any potential danger, suggested something much more personal was developing. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts, followed by male voices speaking in Korean. Jean immediately went on alert, his posture shifting in a way that reminded her he was someone accustomed to potential threats. That's Marcus, he said, relaxing slightly as a younger man appeared in the kitchen doorway. Marcus looked to be in his late 20s, compact and athletic with intelligent eyes, and the kind of easy confidence that suggested he was very good at whatever he did. He was also clearly Korean-American like Jean, though his features were softer and more approachable. The infamous witness, Marcus said with a grin that transformed his serious features. I have to say, Jean, when you decide to complicate your life, you don't do it halfway. Sage, this is Marcus Kim, my second-in-command and the closest thing I have to a brother, Jean said. Marcus, this is Sage Chun, and you'll treat her with the same respect you show my grandmother. Something in Jin's tone made Marcus's expression shift, becoming more serious and considering. He studied Sage's face with the same intensity Jean had shown, his gaze lingering on her unusual eyes. I can see why Halmione is calling her the Lucky Star, Marcus said finally. Those eyes really are something special. Lucky Star? Sage looked between Jean and his grandmother, feeling like she was missing part of the conversation. Uni patted Sage's hand with maternal affection. In our family tradition, blue eyes represent the favor of the sea spirits. When someone blessed with such eyes comes into our lives during troubled times, it's considered a sign that good fortune will follow. The mystical interpretation should have seemed silly or superstitious, but there was something in the older woman's manner that suggested she took these beliefs very seriously. And looking at the way both Jean and Marcus regarded her, Sage got the impression that their respect for Yunhee's spiritual insights was absolute. I've never brought anyone good fortune before, Sage said honestly. Usually, I just make people uncomfortable with questions about my ancestry. That's because you were surrounded by people who didn't understand what they were looking at, Jean said. His hand moved as if he intended to touch hers, then stopped just short, the almost contact more electric than actual touch would have been. Marcus cleared his throat delicately, not to interrupt what appears to be a moment, but we do have some business to discuss. The Tanaka family has made contact. Jin's entire demeanor changed instantly, warmth disappearing as he shifted into what Sage was beginning to recognize as his professional mode. What kind of contact? They sent a formal message through intermediaries, Marcus said, pulling out his phone to read from what appeared to be a text. They're willing to negotiate for the witness's safety in exchange for territorial concessions on the docks. Absolutely not, Jean said immediately. We don't negotiate with terrorists, and we definitely don't trade territory for protection. So what's the alternative? Sage asked, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer. The alternative is that we handle this situation permanently, Jean said grimly. But that will take time and careful planning. Until then, you stay here where you're safe. Sage studied his face, seeing the tension in his jaw and the way his shoulders had tightened with whatever he was planning. For the first time since this began, she had a clear understanding that Jin's world involved violence as a regular business practice. Not just the defensive violence she'd witnessed in the parking garage, but calculated, strategic violence designed to eliminate problems permanently. The knowledge should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself thinking that she was grateful to have someone that capable and determined protecting her. I need to understand something, she said carefully. Last night, you said your family has been an import and export for generations. But that's not really the whole truth, is it? Jean exchanged a look with Marcus that was loaded with meaning she couldn't interpret. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he was choosing his words very carefully. My great-grandfather came to America in 1923 with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around him. He built a legitimate shipping business that served the Korean community when no one else would. But legitimate businesses in immigrant communities sometimes need protection from people who see vulnerability as opportunity. So you started as protection, Sage said, beginning to understand. We evolved into a family that handles problems other people can't solve through conventional means, Jean said. Sometimes that involves violence. Sometimes it involves influence. Always it involves loyalty to the people we consider family. The careful way he explained it made Sage think he was trying to help her understand without forcing her to confront details that might frighten her away. She appreciated the consideration, but she was beginning to realize that if she was going to be part of this world, even temporarily, she needed to understand what she was accepting. You're organized crime, she said bluntly. Not just import and export. You're what people call the Korean Mafia. Jin's smile was sharp and humorless. We prefer to think of ourselves as a family business that operates outside conventional legal frameworks when necessary. Which is organized crime, Sage pressed. Yes, he said simply. It is. The honesty was somehow more reassuring than all his diplomatic explanations had been. At least now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. Exactly who was offering her protection and what that protection might cost. Okay, she said after a moment. I can accept that. Jin's eyebrows rose slightly. Just like that? Sage considered the question seriously, trying to understand her own reaction. By all conventional wisdom, she should be horrified to discover she was under the protection of organized crime figures. She should be demanding police protection, insisting on legitimate legal solutions, running as far and fast as possible from anything illegal or dangerous. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Jean had positioned himself between her and the gunman without hesitation. The way his grandmother had welcomed her with fierce protectiveness. The way Marcus had looked at her with respect rather than the curious stare she usually got from strangers. These people might operate outside the law, but they'd shown her more genuine care and consideration in 12 hours than most of the supposedly legitimate people in her life had shown her in years. Just like that, she said firmly. Whatever you are, whatever your family does, you've kept me safe when I had nowhere else to turn. That matters more than legal technicalities. Jin's expression shifted, becoming softer and more wondering, as if she'd surprised him in some fundamental way. You continue to be remarkable, he said quietly. The compliment made heat flood her cheeks, but before she could respond, Uni spoke up from where she'd been quietly observing their interaction. This is why the spirits brought her to us, she said with satisfaction. Someone with the wisdom to see past surface definitions to the truth underneath. Someone brave enough to choose loyalty over conventional safety. Marcus was grinning openly now, clearly enjoying the dynamic between them. Well, Jean, looks like you've found someone who's not intimidated by the family business. That's either very good or very dangerous. It's very good, Jean said, his gaze never leaving Sage's face. Because it means she's choosing to trust us with full knowledge of what that trust might cost. The weight of his words settled between them like a promise. Sage understood that this was a turning point, that accepting his protection with clear understanding of his world meant stepping across a line she could never uncross. Once she was part of this family circle, even temporarily, she would always be connected to whatever they were and whatever they did. Looking at Jin's serious dark eyes, feeling the warmth of his grandmother's approval and the easy acceptance in Marcus's manner, Sage realized she'd already made her choice. She'd made it the moment she'd taken Jin's hand in the parking garage, the moment she'd followed him into his house, the moment she'd allowed herself to feel safe for the first time in years. I trust you, she said again, the words carrying more weight than they had the night before. All of you. Whatever comes next, I trust you to handle it. Jin's hand finally completed the movement he'd started earlier, covering hers where it rested on the marble countertop. His touch was warm and strong and absolutely certain. Like an anchor in a storm she was just beginning to understand. Then we'll make sure that trust is never misplaced, he said solemnly. No matter what it costs. As his thumb stroked across her knuckles and his grandmother beamed with maternal satisfaction, Sage felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 26 years, she tried to make herself fit into worlds that never quite accepted her, tried to minimize the very things that made her different in hopes of finding acceptance. Sitting in Jin's kitchen, protected by his strength and embraced by his family's fierce loyalty, she finally understood what it felt like to be valued exactly as she was. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, opening possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever complications came from accepting this protection, Sage knew she'd finally found something worth the risk. She'd found people who saw her blue eyes not as a mark of difference to be explained away, but as a sign of good fortune to be treasured. She'd found a family that might actually want her to belong. 3 days into her stay at the Nakamura house, Sage had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the surreal circumstances. She spent her mornings helping Eun-hee with the household accounts, discovering that the family's legitimate businesses were extensive and actually quite profitable. Import companies, restaurant supply chains, real estate holdings, all managed with meticulous attention to detail that spoke to generations of careful business building. Jean had been skeptical when she'd offered to help with the bookkeeping, but after reviewing her work, he'd admitted that her organizational systems were more efficient than anything their current accountants provided. There was something deeply satisfying about applying her professional skills to help people who valued her contribution, even if the context was unlike anything she'd experienced in her corporate career. The afternoons were spent learning about the family's history from Eun-hee, who seemed delighted to have an appreciative audience for stories about her late husband's early struggles in America and the gradual building of what she diplomatically referred to as their security consulting business. The older woman had a gift for storytelling that made even the most mundane business details sound like epic adventures. But it was the evenings that Sage treasured most, when Jean would return from whatever business had occupied his day, and they would share dinner in the elegant dining room or the more casual breakfast nook, depending on his mood and energy level. These conversations revealed layers to his personality that the dangerous circumstances of their meeting hadn't allowed her to see. He was well-educated, with degrees from prestigious universities that he'd completed before taking his place in the family business. He spoke 4 languages fluently and could discuss everything from classical music to modern architecture with the kind of passion that suggested genuine interest rather than social polish. He was also funnier than his serious demeanor suggested, with a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed and comfortable. Tonight, they'd ended up in the library after dinner, a room lined floor to ceiling with books in multiple languages. Jean had been showing her first editions of Korean poetry when his phone rang with the particular tone he'd assigned to family business calls. Sage curled up in one of the leather reading chairs while he took the call in the hallway, speaking in rapid Korean that sounded increasingly tense as the conversation continued. When he returned 20 minutes later, his expression was grim in a way that made her stomach clench with apprehension. "Problem?" she asked, though his face already answered the question. Jean poured himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on the sidebar, his movements sharp with barely controlled tension. "The Tanaka family has decided to escalate their negotiation tactics." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means they've moved beyond watching your apartment and making formal offers," Jean said, taking a substantial drink before continuing. "They've expanded their target list to include your immediate family members." Ice flooded Sage's veins as the implication hit her. "My family. But they're not involved in this. They don't even know what happened to me." "Criminals don't typically limit themselves to direct participants when they want to apply pressure," Jean said grimly. "They've done research on everyone connected to you. Parents in Portland, a sister in college, aunts and uncles scattered across 3 states. Anyone they think you might care enough about to bargain for." The casual way he recited details about her family members made Sage realize how thoroughly the Tanaka organization had investigated her life. But more frightening was the implication that these people were willing to threaten innocent relatives to get what they wanted from her. "What kind of research?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Addresses, daily routines, weak points in their personal security," Jean said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to thinking in those terms. "Your sister Lily walks alone across campus every Tuesday and Thursday evening after her astronomy lab. Your parents follow the same route to their neighborhood grocery store every Saturday morning. Your aunt in Sacramento drops her children off at the same daycare center every weekday at 8:15. Stop, Sage said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please stop. Jean immediately crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. His hands covered hers where they'd clenched into fists in her lap, his touch warm and steadying despite the terrible conversation they were having. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, he said gently. I'm telling you because you need to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. These aren't people who make idle threats. So what do we do? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her system. How do we protect them? We're already working on it, Jean said. Marcus has teams moving to provide discreet protection for your immediate family members. But the Tanaka group has made it clear they're prepared to take direct action if their demands aren't met. What are their demands? They want you to testify that you didn't witness anything criminal in that parking garage, Jean said. They want you to say it was a personal dispute that got out of hand, nothing more. And they want my family to cede control of 3 prime shipping contracts to their operations. Sage processed this information, understanding that the stakes had moved far beyond her personal safety. If she's never seen Jin's people, if she'd never witnessed the confrontation that started all this, she might have been tempted to simply give the Tanaka family what they wanted in exchange for leaving her loved ones alone. But she had seen Jin in action. She'd watched him put himself between her and armed men without hesitation. She'd experienced the fierce protectiveness of his family, the way they'd welcomed her and made her feel valued for exactly who she was. The idea of betraying that trust, even to protect her own relatives, felt fundamentally wrong. If I do what they want, she said slowly, what happens to your family? Jin's expression shifted, becoming more serious and considering. We lose face and territory, which invites further challenges from other rival organizations, he said honestly. More importantly, we send a message that threatening civilians under our protection is an effective strategy. That makes everyone we care about less safe in the long run. So if I cooperate with them, I might save my family but endanger yours. And if you don't cooperate, we'll find another way to protect everyone you care about, Jean said firmly. But it will require eliminating the Tanaka leadership entirely. Eliminating. There was that word again, spoken with the same casual certainty Jean used to discuss business meetings or dinner plans. Sage was beginning to understand that violence wasn't something Jin's family avoided or regretted. It was simply another tool they used when circumstances required it. How long would that take? She asked. Weeks, possibly months, Jean admitted. We'd have to be careful and methodical to avoid triggering a larger war between families. But it can be done. Months of living in hiding while Jin's people systematically dismantled a rival criminal organization. Months of her family being under threat, of looking over their shoulders and wondering if they were safe. The prospect was exhausting and terrifying, but something in Jin's steady confidence made her believe it was also achievable. There's something else I need to tell you, Jean said, his voice dropping to something more personal and vulnerable. Something that will help you understand why I'm so determined to keep you safe. Sage settled back in her chair, recognizing the shift in his tone that suggested they were moving into more intimate emotional territory. Tell me. Jean was quiet for a long moment. His dark eyes focused on something beyond her shoulder, as if he was gathering courage for whatever he needed to say. 5 years ago, I was involved with someone, he said finally. Her name was Mia, and she was a prosecutor who specialized in organized crime cases. We met at a university fundraiser, and she had no idea who I was or what my family did when we started dating. Sage felt an unexpected stab of jealousy at the mention of another woman in Jin's life, followed immediately by curiosity about what had happened to end the relationship. When she found out about my background, she was fascinated rather than frightened, Jean continued. She thought she could use her position to help legitimize our operations, to find ways for us to work with law enforcement rather than around it. She believed people could change if they had the right motivation. That sounded like a dangerous position for a prosecutor to take, especially one involved with someone from the world she was supposed to be prosecuting. The Yamamoto family found out about our relationship, Jean said, his voice becoming harder. They decided she was a threat to their operations and a weakness they could exploit. One night, she left her office late after working on a case that would have sent several of their people to prison for decades. Sage could see where this story was going, and her heart began to race with sympathetic dread. They grabbed her in the parking garage of the courthouse. Jean said with the flat tone of someone who'd told this story before but never gotten used to the pain of it. Demanded that she drop all cases against their organization and provide them with inside information about ongoing investigations. When she refused, they executed her and left her body where I would find it. The terrible simplicity of the statement hit Sage like a physical blow. She could see the grief and guilt in Jin's face, understand now why his protective instincts were so intense, and why the idea of her being threatened by similar people affected him so deeply. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to offer something. "I swore that night that I would never again allow someone I cared about to be endangered because of my world," Jean said. "I've avoided serious relationships, kept my distance from anyone who could become a target. Until you." "Until me," Sage repeated, her heart racing at the implication. "Until you walked into my life with those remarkable blue eyes and more courage than sense," Jean said, his gaze finding hers with devastating intensity. "Until you chose to trust me despite knowing exactly what my family does. Until you made me want to risk everything I swore I'd never risk again." The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sage could feel the weight of Jin's confession, the significance of him choosing to tell her about Mia and what her death had meant to him. "Jean," she said softly, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing this moment felt like a turning point in whatever was developing between them. He rose from where he'd been kneeling beside her chair and extended his hand with the same formal courtesy he'd shown her that first night in the parking garage. But this time, there was nothing desperate or urgent in the gesture. This time, it was a choice offered freely, with full knowledge of what acceptance might mean. Sage took his hand without hesitation, allowing him to draw her to her feet. They were standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way his pupils had dilated in the soft library lighting. "I care about you, Sage," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "More than I should, considering how long we've known each other. More than is safe for either of us." "I care about you too," she admitted, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I know it's crazy. I know it's too fast. But sitting here in your house, being protected by your family, talking with you like this, it feels more right than anything has ever felt in my life." Jin's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking across her cheekbone with exquisite gentleness. "You're so beautiful," he said softly. "Not just your eyes, though they're extraordinary. Everything about you. Your courage, your intelligence, the way you see past surface appearances to what really matters." No one had ever spoken to her like that before, with that particular combination of reverence and desire that made her feel precious and wanted in equal measure. Looking into Jin's dark eyes, feeling the controlled strength in his touch, Sage understood that whatever was happening between them had moved far beyond simple attraction or gratitude for protection. "Jean," she said again, and this time his name carried all the longing and uncertainty and hope she couldn't articulate. He leaned closer, his forehead coming to rest against hers in a gesture that was intimate without being demanding. She could feel his breath against her lips, could see the way his eyes had darkened with something that made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly. "If this is too fast, if you need more time, tell me to stop and I will." Instead of answering, Sage let her eyes drift closed and tilted her face up slightly, a wordless invitation that he accepted with reverent care. When Jean kissed her, it was nothing like the desperate, hungry kisses she'd read about in novels or seen in movies. It was soft and questioning, a gentle exploration that spoke of patience and respect, and the kind of controlled passion that promised much more if she wanted it. Sage found herself melting into him, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart. The kiss deepened naturally, becoming more sure and thorough as she responded with growing confidence. When they finally broke apart, both breathing slightly harder than normal, Jean kept his arms around her in a way that felt protective and possessive in equal measure. "That was," she started, then realized she had no idea how to finish the sentence. "Perfect," Jean supplied, his voice warm with satisfaction and something that might have been amazement. That was absolutely perfect. Before Sage could respond, the sharp chime of Jin's phone shattered the intimate moment like glass breaking. The sound was different from his usual business calls, sharper and more urgent in a way that made him immediately release her and check the message. What she saw in his face as he read made her blood run cold with dread. "What is it?" she asked, though his expression already told her it was something terrible. Jin's jaw was tight with barely controlled fury as he looked up from his phone. "They have your sister," he said simply. "The Tanaka family just sent proof of life photos and a list of demands." The words hit Sage like a physical blow, making her legs suddenly unsteady. Lily, her baby sister, barely 20 years old and completely innocent of anything connected to this nightmare, was now in the hands of people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. "Show me," Sage said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Jean hesitated, clearly reluctant to subject her to whatever images they'd sent. "Show me," she repeated more firmly. "I need to see that she's alive and unharmed." Jean handed her the phone reluctantly, and Sage forced herself to look at the photos despite every instinct that screamed at her to turn away. Lily was sitting in what appeared to be a warehouse or empty office building, her hands zip-tied behind her back, but no visible injuries on her pale face. She looked terrified but alert, which Sage chose to interpret as positive signs. The text below the photos was brief and to the point. "Witness testifies to personal dispute only. Nakamura family cedes doc contracts. 24 hours compliance or the sister disappears permanently." 24 hours, Sage said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "They want an answer in 24 hours. "They'll get an answer," Jean said grimly, already reaching for his jacket. "But it won't be the one they're expecting." "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done 3 days ago," Jean said, his voice carrying the kind of cold determination that reminded Sage exactly who she was dealing with. "I'm going to eliminate this threat permanently." "I'm coming with you," Sage said immediately. Jin's response was swift and absolute. "No, absolutely not. You'll stay here where you're safe while we handle this." "That's my sister they have," Sage said, her own voice taking on a steely quality she'd never heard from herself before. "I'm not sitting here drinking tea while you risk your life to save her. I'm coming with you." "Sage, be reasonable. This is going to be dangerous, and you have no experience with this kind of situation." "I have experience with being underestimated because I'm quiet and polite and have unusual eyes," Sage said firmly. "I have experience with people assuming I'm fragile because I work with numbers instead of weapons. But I also have experience with doing whatever it takes to protect the people I love. And Lily is the only family I have who ever made me feel like I belonged exactly as I am." Jean stared at her for a long moment, seeming to see something in her expression that made him reconsider his automatic refusal. "If you come, you follow orders without question," he said finally. "You stay where I put you, and you don't take unnecessary risks. This isn't a negotiation, it's a rescue operation, and people who don't follow the plan get killed." "I understand," Sage said, though her heart was racing with fear and adrenaline and the absolute determination to be part of saving her sister. "I'll do whatever you tell me to do." Jean studied her face for another moment, then nodded curtly. "We leave in an hour. Marcus is coordinating surveillance and entry strategies now." As he headed for the door to begin whatever preparations were necessary for a rescue operation, Sage caught his arm. "Jean, wait." He turned back to her with barely controlled impatience, clearly already focused on the tactical challenges ahead. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. For protecting me, for caring about my family, for being willing to risk your people to save someone you've never met. Thank you." Jin's expression softened slightly, the cold tactical focus warming into something more personal. "She's important to you, which makes her important to me," he said. "And after what just happened between us, there's no question of not bringing her home safely." The promise in his voice made Sage's chest tight with emotion that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that somewhere in the space of 3 days, she'd fallen completely in love with a man whose world was dangerous and complicated and utterly unlike anything she'd ever imagined for herself. But looking at Jin's determined face, feeling the absolute certainty of his protection and the fierce warmth of his care, Sage knew she wouldn't change any of it. Whatever risks came with loving someone like Jean, Whatever complications arose from accepting his world as her own, it was worth it for the way he looked at her like she was something precious and powerful and absolutely essential to his happiness. "All right," she said, squaring her shoulders with new resolve. "Let's go save my sister and end this threat permanently." Jin's smile was sharp and lethal and absolutely beautiful. "That's my girl," he said with satisfaction. "Now let's show the Tanaka family what happens when they threaten someone under Nakamura protection." As they headed upstairs to prepare for whatever the night would bring, Sage felt something fundamental click into place in her chest. She was no longer the quiet accountant who tried to make herself invisible to avoid drawing attention to her differences. She was someone worth fighting for, someone worth protecting, someone powerful enough to demand a place in the battle for her own family's safety. She was exactly who she was meant to be, and that was apparently someone strong enough to stand beside Jin Nakamura and face down whatever enemies dared to threaten the people they loved. The warehouse district at 2 in the morning was a maze of shadows and industrial silence, broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional rumble of freight trains moving through the rail yards. Sage crouched behind the panel van with Jean and 4 of his most trusted men, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the building where her sister was being held. Marcus had done excellent reconnaissance work over the past 6 hours. The Tanaka family was using an abandoned packaging facility with minimal security, clearly confident that their possession of Lily gave them all the leverage they needed. 3 guards rotated shifts around the perimeter, and thermal imaging suggested another 4 to 6 people inside the main building. Poor tactical position for a defensive operation, Jean had observed during their planning session. They're not expecting an assault, which means they've gotten careless with their security protocols. Sage wore black tactical gear that Marcus had provided, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and grimly determined in the unfamiliar clothing. She'd never imagined herself preparing for what amounted to a military operation, but the sight of her terrified sister in those photos had awakened something fierce and protective in her that felt entirely natural. "Remember," Jean said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the small earpiece they'd fitted her with. "You stay with Chun and Rodriguez at the south entrance until we signal all clear. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you don't move until I tell you it's safe." "Understood," Sage replied, checking the small pistol Jean had insisted she carried despite her protests that she'd never fired a weapon in her life. "It's not about your accuracy," he'd explained. "It's about having options if everything goes wrong." The idea of everything going wrong made her stomach clench with terror, but not for herself. The thought of Jean or his people being hurt because they were risking themselves for her family was almost unbearable. These men barely knew her, and they were preparing to engage in potentially lethal combat because she mattered to their leader. Jin's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing gently. "We've done operations like this dozens of times," he said with quiet confidence. "Simple extraction, minimal resistance expected, overwhelming tactical advantage on our side. We'll have your sister out of there in 15 minutes. "What about the Tanaka leadership?" Sage asked. "Even if we rescue Lily, they'll just regroup and try again." Jin's smile was sharp and lethal in the dim light from the warehouse district's security lamps. "Mr. Tanaka himself is supervising this operation personally. Apparently, he wanted to ensure there were no communication failures regarding their demands. Which means he's in that building," Sage realized. "Which means this ends tonight," Jean confirmed. "One way or another, the threat to you and your family dies with him." The casual way he discussed killing someone should have horrified her, but Sage found herself thinking only of Lily's terrified face and the long months of looking over their shoulders that would follow if these people remained alive to pursue their vendetta. Sometimes violence was the only solution that actually solved the problem. 2 minutes, Marcus reported through their communications system. "Perimeter guards are down. Entry teams are in position." Jean turned to face Sage fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness. "When this is over, when your sister is safe and the threat is eliminated, we need to talk about what comes next." "What comes next?" Sage asked, though her racing heart already understood the implication. "What comes next for us?" Jean said simply. "Because after tonight, there's no pretending this is temporary or that you can go back to your old life. You'll have been part of a Nakamura family operation, which makes you one of us permanently." The weight of what he was saying settled over her like a warm blanket. There would be no returning to her quiet accounting job, her predictable routine, her carefully invisible existence. After tonight, she would be irrevocably connected to Jin's world with all its dangers and complications. I know, she said quietly. I understand what this means. Do you? Jin asked, his dark eyes searching her face. Because it means accepting that the man you're involved with kills people when necessary. It means living with security concerns and family loyalty that might sometimes conflict with conventional morality. It means choosing a life that most people would consider terrifying. Before Sage could respond, Marcus's voice crackled through their earpieces. 30 seconds to breach. Everyone in position. Jin pressed his forehead against hers briefly, the gesture both intimate and desperate. I love you, Sage, he said with quiet intensity. I know it's too soon. I know the circumstances are insane, but I needed you to know before we do this. The confession hit her like electricity, making her breath catch with the force of emotion that followed. She'd known her own feelings were heading in that direction, but hearing Jin say the words aloud made everything suddenly real and immediate and absolutely critical. I love you too, she said, the words coming out steady and sure despite the chaos about to unfold around them. Whatever happens tonight, whatever comes after, I love you. Jin's kiss was swift and fierce, a claiming that tasted of promise and desperation in equal measure. Then he was moving away from her, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency and shifting into the cold tactical focus she'd seen glimpses of over the past few days. Chun, Rodriguez, remember your positioning, he said into his mic. Sage, you stay put no matter what. Understood? Understood, she replied, though every instinct screamed at her to stay close to him. Go, Marcus said through the communication system. Breach in 3, 2, 1. The next 15 minutes unfolded with brutal efficiency that spoke to extensive planning and professional execution. Sage heard the sharp crack of flashbang grenades, followed by shouting in multiple languages and the controlled burst of automatic weapons fire. Through her earpiece, she could track the progress as Jin's team moved methodically through the building, neutralizing resistance and securing each room. Target acquired, Jin's voice reported with satisfaction. Southeast corner, second floor. Moving to extract. That was Lily. They'd found her sister alive and apparently unharmed, which made Sage's knees suddenly weak with relief. 6 hostiles down, Marcus reported clinically. Building secured, extraction in progress. The clinical language disguised the fact that 6 people had just died, but Sage found she couldn't summon any sympathy for men who'd been prepared to murder an innocent college student to achieve their business objectives. Some lines, once crossed, forfeited any claim to mercy. Package secured and mobile, Jin's voice came through clearly. Bring the vehicle around for pickup. Chin tapped Sage's shoulder and gestured toward the van. That's our signal, he said. Your sister's safe. Relief flooded through Sage's system so intensely that she felt dizzy. Lily was alive and unharmed and free, which was the only thing that had mattered for the past 6 hours of planning and terror. The reunion 5 minutes later was everything Sage had hoped for and feared in equal measure. Lily flew into her arms with desperate strength, sobbing against her shoulder with the kind of terror and relief that could only come from facing death and finding rescue. I thought I was going to die, Lily whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. They said they were going to kill me if you didn't do what they wanted, and I didn't even understand what was happening or why. You're safe now, Sage said fiercely, holding her sister tight and trying not to think about how close they'd come to losing her. It's over. The people who took you are gone, and they're never going to hurt you or anyone else again. Lily pulled back to study Sage's face, clearly trying to process the tactical gear and the grim satisfaction in her sister's expression. Who are these people? She asked, looking around at Jin and his team with obvious confusion. And why do you look like you're part of some kind of military operation? Before Sage could figure out how to explain the past week of her life, Jin approached with the kind of controlled movement that suggested he was still operating in tactical mode despite the successful mission completion. Miss Chun, he said formally, extending his hand to Lily with courteous respect. I'm Jin Nakamura. I'm responsible for your rescue and your ongoing safety. Lily shook his hand automatically, but her eyes found Sage's with growing understanding. This is him, isn't it? She said softly. The man you've been staying with. Yes, Sage said simply, seeing no point in elaborate explanations when the truth was obvious from their interactions. Lily studied Jin's face with the kind of direct assessment that had always made her seem older than her 20 years. "Are you in love with my sister?" she asked bluntly. Jin's answer was immediate and unwavering. "Completely and permanently," he said with the quiet certainty of someone stating an established fact. "And you?" Lily said, turning to Sage with raised eyebrows. "Are you in love with him?" "Completely and permanently," Sage echoed, using Jin's exact words because they captured the truth perfectly. Lily nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Good," she said with satisfaction. "You've been alone too long, and he looks like someone who knows how to take care of what belongs to him." The matter-of-fact acceptance from her sister made Sage's throat tight with unexpected emotion. She'd been prepared for shock, horror, demands for explanations about the criminal world she'd apparently entered. Instead, Lily seemed primarily concerned with whether the relationship itself was solid. "We should get moving," Marcus interrupted apologetically. "Local authorities will respond to the weapons fire eventually, and we want to be elsewhere when that happens." The ride back to the Nakamura house was quiet, with Lily exhausted from her ordeal and everyone else coming down from the adrenaline of combat operations. But Sage found herself hyper-aware of Jin's presence beside her, of the way he kept one protective hand on her knee and periodically checked to ensure both sisters were unharmed. When they finally arrived at the house, Uni was waiting with medical supplies and the kind of maternal fussing that Lily clearly needed despite her attempts to downplay her trauma. Within an hour, Sage's sister was settled in the guest room adjacent to her own, fed and bandaged, and finally feeling secure enough to sleep, which left Sage alone with Jean in the library where they'd shared their first kiss just hours earlier. The contrast between that tender moment and the lethal efficiency she'd witnessed tonight was jarring, though not as disturbing as it probably should have been. "It's really over?" she asked, needing confirmation that the threat had been eliminated completely. "Tanaka and his senior lieutenants are dead," Jean said with finality. "The rest of his organization will be too busy fighting over succession to concern themselves with revenge operations. Your family is safe permanently." The weight of permanent safety was almost incomprehensible after days of living under constant threat. Sage sank onto the leather sofa with sudden exhaustion, the adrenaline finally leaving her system and making her aware of how terrified she'd actually been. Jean settled beside her, close enough that she could lean into his warmth, but not crowding her when she might need space to process everything that had happened. "How do you feel about what you saw tonight?" he asked quietly. "About what we did to save your sister." Sage considered the question seriously, examining her own emotional response to the violence and death that had secured Lily's freedom. By conventional moral standards, she should probably be horrified by the killing, traumatized by her proximity to organized crime operations. Instead, she found herself thinking about Lily's terrified face in those photos, about the casual way the Tanaka leadership had threatened her entire family to achieve their business objectives. "I feel grateful," she said honestly. "I feel like justice was done by people who were willing to risk themselves for someone they barely knew. I feel like I've seen what real loyalty and protection look like." Jin's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his side with gentle insistence. "You understand that there's no going back from this," he said. "After tonight, you're part of this world whether you choose to stay with me or not. You've been involved in a Nakamura operation, which makes you family permanently." "I know," Sage said, settling more comfortably against his chest. "The question is whether you want that. Whether you're prepared to build a life with someone whose world involves this kind of danger." Jean was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking through her hair with absent affection. "5 years ago, I would have said no," he said finally. "5 years ago, I would have made sure you were safe and then found ways to distance myself to protect you from exactly this kind of situation. And now? Now I've spent a week watching you handle every challenge with more courage and grace than I thought possible. Now I've seen you choose to trust me even when you understood exactly what that trust meant. Now I know what it feels like to love someone who sees past surface definitions to what really matters." Jean shifted beside her, moving so he could look directly into her face. The library lighting caught the blue of her eyes, making them seem to glow with their own inner light. "I'm asking you to marry me, Sage," he said with quiet intensity. Not because of what happened tonight. Not because you need protection or because you're grateful for what we did. I'm asking because I can't imagine building a life without you in it. The proposal hit her like lightning, though some part of her had been expecting it since their conversation before the rescue operation. This wasn't a man who did anything halfway, and if he decided he wanted her permanently, he would move to secure that commitment immediately. You're asking me to marry into organized crime, she said, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than objection. I'm asking you to marry me, Jean corrected. Everything else is just context. The question is whether you love me enough to accept the complications that come with who I am. Sage studied his face, seeing the vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. For all his power and competence, Jean was essentially asking whether she thought he was worth the risks that came with loving him. The answer was so obvious, she almost laughed. Yes, she said simply. Yes to marrying you. Yes to accepting your world. Yes to building a life together despite every rational argument against it. Jin's smile was brilliant and relieved and absolutely devastating. You're sure? Because once we're married, there's no graceful exit strategy. You'll be in Nakamura permanently, which means our enemies become your enemies and our family loyalty becomes your family loyalty. I'm sure, Sage said firmly. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Jin's kiss was different from their first one in the library, deeper and more possessive and carrying promises of things to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than normal, his dark eyes were bright with satisfaction and something that looked very much like wonder. My grandmother is going to be impossibly smug about this, he said with amusement. She's been predicting this outcome since the moment she saw your eyes. Speaking of your grandmother, Sage said with sudden realization, does she know what happened tonight? Does she know about the rescue operation? Jin's grin was boyish and completely charming. Where do you think I learned tactical planning and strategic thinking? Halmini spent 40 years managing family operations before she retired to focus on spiritual guidance and excessive matchmaking. The idea of elegant, tea-serving, unhi-coordinating criminal enterprises was so unexpected that Sage found herself laughing despite everything they'd just been through. I have so much to learn about this family, she said with mock despair. You have the rest of your life to learn, Jean said with satisfaction. Starting with a wedding that will probably involve half the Korean-American community and enough food to feed a small army. Sounds perfect, Sage said, and realized she meant it completely. Looking into Jin's dark eyes, feeling the absolute certainty of his love and protection, Sage understood that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Not just safety, but purpose. Not just love, but the kind of partnership that made both people stronger and more complete than they could ever be alone. Her blue eyes that had always marked her as different had brought her to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She'd found a family that treasured what made her unique, a man who saw her differences as gifts rather than obstacles, and a life that was dangerous and complicated and absolutely perfect for who she was meant to become. She'd found home. 6 months later, Sage sat in her new office overlooking the Seattle waterfront, reviewing quarterly reports for Nakamura International's legitimate shipping operations. The space was elegant and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of Elliott Bay and furnishings that spoke of both success and excellent taste. But it was the framed photo on her desk that made her smile every time she looked up from her computer. Jean on their wedding day, devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo, looking at her with such obvious adoration that several guests had commented on the intensity of his expression. Beside it sat a smaller frame containing the official family portrait from the reception, with Uni beaming between them and Lily laughing at something Marcus had whispered in her ear. The wedding had been everything Jean had promised and more, a celebration that somehow managed to honor both Korean traditions and American customs, while accommodating a guest list that included everyone from university professors to shipping executives to people whose business cards were deliberately vague about their actual occupations. Sage had worn a traditional hanbok for the ceremony and a stunning white gown for the reception, feeling beautiful and cherished and absolutely certain that she was exactly where she belonged. The transformation in her own confidence still surprised her sometimes. The woman who had once tried to make herself invisible in corporate meetings now commanded attention in boardrooms filled with powerful men who had initially been skeptical of Jin's choice to marry an outsider. Her analytical skills and organizational abilities had quickly proven invaluable to the family's extensive legitimate enterprises, and her unusual blue eyes had become something of a good luck charm among the organization's members. Lucky Star, they called her now, with the same affectionate reverence Uni had shown from their first meeting. The nickname had started as spiritual symbolism, but had evolved into something more practical when 3 major business deals had closed successfully after Sage had reviewed the financial projections. Whether the correlation was supernatural or simply the result of her thorough analysis didn't matter to people who valued results over explanations. The sound of her office door opening interrupted her thoughts, and Sage looked up to see Jean entering with the kind of predatory grace that still made her pulse quicken even after months of marriage. He'd been in meetings all morning with potential partners for a new legitimate security consulting venture, and his satisfied expression suggested the negotiations had gone well. "How did it go with the Morrison Group?" Sage asked, automatically saving her work and giving him her full attention. "Better than expected," Jean said, circling her desk to perch on the edge close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "They're interested in a comprehensive security package for their international operations, and they specifically requested you to handle the financial structuring." "They requested me specifically?" Sage couldn't hide her pleased surprise. The Morrison Group was exactly the kind of high-profile, legitimate client that would help establish their security consulting business as a respected industry leader. "Apparently your reputation for analytical precision is becoming well known in certain circles," Jean said with obvious pride. "Marcus thinks we could triple our legitimate revenue within 2 years if we keep attracting clients of this caliber." The pride in his voice made warmth spread through Sage's chest. 6 months ago, she'd been a nobody accountant processing tax returns for people who barely noticed her existence. Now she was building a business empire alongside the man she loved, using her skills to create something meaningful and lasting. "I have something else to tell you," she said, suddenly nervous about the conversation she'd been planning all morning. Jin's expression became more focused, clearly picking up on the shift in her tone. "Good news or concerning news?" "Good news," Sage said, though her heart was racing with anticipation. "Very good news, actually." She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew the small envelope she'd been carrying around for the past 2 days, trying to find the perfect moment for this revelation. Inside was a single photograph that would change everything about their future together. Jean took the envelope with curious concern, his dark eyes studying her face as if trying to read her intentions. When he opened it and saw the ultrasound image inside, his expression went completely blank with shock. "Is this?" he started, then seemed to lose the ability to form complete sentences. 8 weeks, Sage confirmed, watching his face with growing amusement as the implications sank in. "Dr. Kim says everything looks perfectly normal and healthy." Jean stared at the ultrasound image with the kind of reverent wonder typically reserved for religious experiences. The tiny blob that would eventually become their child was barely visible, but to Jean it might as well have been the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "You're pregnant," he said, as if testing the words to make sure they were real. "We're pregnant," Sage corrected gently. "And before you start worrying about safety and security implications, Dr. Kim says there's no reason I can't continue working normally for several more months." Jean set the ultrasound carefully on her desk, then pulled her to her feet and into his arms with the kind of careful intensity that suggested he was trying not to overwhelm her with the force of his reaction. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I love you so much it sometimes scares me. And now we're going to have a baby who will probably inherit your remarkable eyes and your stubborn independence." "Stubborn independence," Sage repeated with mock indignation. "I prefer to think of it as strategic determination." Jin's laugh was pure joy, the sound making Sage's chest tight with happiness. Their child would grow up surrounded by this kind of love, protected by Jin's strength and Yunhee's wisdom, welcomed into a family that valued loyalty and intelligence and the courage to be exactly who you were meant to be. "Halmione is going to be impossible when we tell her," Jean said with fond exasperation. "She's been dropping hints about great-grandchildren since our honeymoon." She's been embroidering baby blankets for the past month, Sage admitted. I think she knew before we did. Of course she did, Jean said with resignation. My grandmother has mystical insights about everything important. She probably chose our child's Korean name weeks ago. The sound of voices in the hallway indicated that the rest of the family was returning from their various morning meetings. Marcus and Lily had officially begun dating 3 months earlier, a development that delighted Eunhee and provided endless entertainment for everyone else. Watching her serious, academic sister navigate a relationship with Jin's charming second-in-command had been one of the unexpected pleasures of Sage's new life. Are you ready to tell everyone? Jean asked, his hand coming to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. I've been ready since Dr. Kim confirmed it, Sage said honestly. This baby is going to be the most loved and protected child in the history of the Nakamura family. The family gathering that followed was everything Sage had hoped for and more. Eunhee cried with joy and immediately began planning nursery decorations. Marcus congratulated Jean with the kind of emotional intensity that confirmed their brotherhood went far beyond business partnership. Lily demanded to know if she could teach her future niece or nephew about astronomy and declare herself the coolest aunt in Seattle. But it was the quiet moment later that evening that Sage treasured most, when she and Jean were alone in their bedroom discussing practical plans for expanding their house and adjusting her work schedule as the pregnancy progressed. Do you ever regret it? Jean asked quietly, his hand splayed protectively across her stomach as they lay tangled together in their bed. Do you ever wish you'd chosen the safe, predictable life instead of this complicated one? Sage considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman she'd been 6 months earlier. Lonely, invisible, convinced that her differences made her less valuable rather than more unique. That woman had been safe and predictable and utterly unfulfilled, going through the motions of existence without ever truly feeling alive. Never, she said with absolute certainty. Not once, not even for a second. This life, this family, this love, it's everything I never knew I wanted because I never thought it was possible. Jin's smile was soft and wondering in the dim bedroom lighting. You continue to amaze me, he said quietly. Every day, you become more beautiful and more remarkable, and I fall more in love with who you are. The confession made Sage's throat tight with emotion, though she was getting better at accepting the kind of intense adoration Jean offered so freely. 6 months of marriage had taught her that his love wasn't conditional on her being perfect or grateful or anything other than exactly herself. I have something I want you to know, she said, turning in his arms so she could see his face clearly. About what you said that first night, about my eyes being lucky. Jin's expression became more attentive, clearly sensing that this was important to her. I spent my entire life thinking these eyes made me different in ways that were problematic, Sage continued. I thought they marked me as someone who didn't quite belong anywhere, someone who needed to apologize for not fitting standard definitions. And now? Jean asked softly. Now I understand that they brought me exactly where I needed to be, to exactly the people who would value what makes me unique, she said with quiet confidence. They brought me to you, to this family, to this life where being different isn't something to overcome, but something to celebrate. Jin's kiss was tender and thorough and full of promises about the future they were building together. When they finally broke apart, his dark eyes were bright with satisfaction and something that looked very much like reverence. Our children are going to grow up knowing they're treasured exactly as they are, he said with quiet intensity. No matter what they look like, no matter how they differ from expectations, they'll know that being unique makes them powerful rather than problematic. The promise made Sage's eyes sting with happy tears. Their children would never experience the isolation and self-doubt that had defined her early years. They would grow up surrounded by fierce love and unwavering acceptance, secure in the knowledge that they belonged completely and permanently. I love our life, she said simply, the words encompassing everything they'd built together and everything they were planning to create. So do I, Jean replied with deep satisfaction. So do I. As Sage drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, protected by his love and surrounded by his family's acceptance, she reflected on how dramatically her existence had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been working late in an empty office building, invisible and alone, convinced that her differences made her fundamentally unlovable. Now she wore Jin's platinum wedding ring alongside the traditional Korean betrothal jewelry Uni had given her, symbols of belonging that caught the light every time she moved her hands. Now she had work that challenged her intellect and skills that were valued by people who mattered. Now she had love that was fierce and protective and absolutely unwavering, the kind of partnership she'd never dared to imagine. Most importantly, now she had a future that was bright with possibility and promise. A baby who would inherit the best of both parents, a family business that was thriving and growing, a marriage that was built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. She'd found everything she'd been searching for without knowing it. And it had started with one terrifying night in a parking garage when a stranger with kind eyes had chosen to protect her rather than walk away. Before I let you go, I'd love to hear from you about what you loved most about Sage and Jin's journey together. What moment resonated with you the most? Have you ever experienced that feeling of finally finding where you truly belong? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your stories and insights always inspire me. The blue eyes that had once made Sage feel like an outsider had turned out to be exactly what brought her home. Sometimes the things that make us different are the very things that lead us to where we're meant to be. And sometimes love really can transform everything if we're brave enough to trust it. In the end, that was the only lesson that truly mattered. That belonging isn't about fitting into someone else's definition of normal, but about finding the people who celebrate what makes you uniquely yourself. And Sage Chun Nakamura, wife and partner and soon-to-be mother, had finally found exactly where she belonged.